Hi, I'm Arun George, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In today's episode, we're looking at the sudden resignation of Jammu and Kashmir's first Lieutenant Governor since it became a union territory. We're also examining how Pakistan has been denying Indian national Kulbhushan Jadhav, a lawyer, effectively denying him a chance to appeal against his death sentence. But first, we're looking at the Reserve Bank of India, or RBI's decision to leave interest rates untouched and other measures it has announced. On Thursday, RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das announced that the Indian Central Bank was leaving interest rates untouched. Despite an economic slowdown, the central bank decided not to pump more money into the economy. We're now speaking with Udit Misra, who writes on the economy and finance for the Indian Express, to try and decode this decision and other announcements made by the central bank. Okay, so Udit, given the slowdown, many thought the RBI was going to ease interest rates and let more money into the economy. But what's the logic behind the central bank keeping rates untouched?
So, see, it is true that the world over, economic growth is a massive concern. And most central banks are involved in trying to boost economic growth. But in India's case, if you look at the retail inflation rate, which is the main mandate of Reserve Bank of India to maintain the retail inflation at 4% level with a margin of error of 2 percentage points. So the retail inflation can go between 2% to 6%. So if you look at the inflation rate in this year, barring March, inflation rate has been above 6%. So that is an increasing concern for RBI, that it wants to boost growth, and for boosting growth, it wants to cut interest rates and make it easier for people to take loans and invest. Inflation is continuing to stay above the RBI's comfort zone, as it were. So that is one big reason why RBI has taken a pause. The second reason is obviously that since the COVID disruption hit the economy, RBI has already cut the repo rates, which are the benchmark rates for the economy, by around 115 basis points, which is roughly 1.15 percentage points. And not all of that has been, first of all, transmitted to the banks. And to the extent that it has been transmitted to the banking system, banks are holding back from extending that as loans to the broader economy, to say people like you and me who might be wanting to start a business or take more loans. Then there is an additional factor that overall the demand in the economy is also down. So what the RBI is seeing is that, first of all, whatever they have done till now has not had its complete effect. And typically monetary policy, these repo rate cuts do take 3 to 6 months at least to have an actual effect on ground. Also the fact that inflation concerns are massive. And so this is very crucial to mention here, that first time that I'm seeing in so many years that RBI is not actually given a clear outlook on inflation. Typically, every monetary policy, RBI gives a clear outlook on what it expects the inflation to be. And similarly for growth. But this time, RBI stayed away from giving an outlook on growth and inflation. And that basically means that RBI doesn't know what will happen to inflation. Will it get worse from here? Will it get better? So it wants to wait and see, depending on how the inflation rate progresses from here, it'll take a decision.
But then one question would be, why is inflation a worry given the economy is in a slowdown? Shouldn't you kind of pump more money into the economy to kind of let people start spending more?
Typically, when the GDP growth rate slows down, inflation also falls because there are fewer people asking for goods. So inflation is basically money chasing goods. If GDP falls, then inflation also sort of sobers down. And typically when inflation becomes a concern, it is because GDP is growing really fast. So in a normal situation, it is right that RBI either has to tackle with containing inflation or boosting growth. What is happening in these COVID times is that because of the disruption in economic activity, there has been a certain shock, not just to the demand side of the economy, which is to say that people have lost jobs or they're not making as much money, and so their demand is coming down, which is showing up in the GDP contracting. But there is also a supply shock, which is to say that goods are not getting from one place to another. And as a result, there is a gap in the demand supply, and the prices are rising because of that. So there is a GDP contraction, and yet inflation is going up because of the supply constraints.
You also mentioned that the GDP is not been mentioned in its forecast. The RBI has not mentioned it. How worrying is something like that?
So it is very worrying that RBI does not want to state what the GDP or inflation figures would be. It shows that a lot of key policy makers themselves do not have a clear understanding of how the economy is moving. So you're sort of fighting blind. When we talk about trying to improve policy efficacy, when we talk about choosing the right policies, it is all contingent on whether the policymakers can clearly see where it's going. As individual economic agents, you and I may not know what is happening under normal circumstances, but times are so bad that even policymakers who have an aggregate understanding, who have a broader understanding, who have much better resources to figure out which way the winds are blowing, they are not able to figure out how far would growth be dented and how far would inflation go up. So it's a worrying thing.
So the RBI has also announced multiple measures like for NBFCs, a resolution framework for stressed assets, greater gold loans. Could you explain what these measures are aiming to achieve and how much can they actually do anything?
So the RBI has done a lot on the front of trying to help within the framework of what it can possibly do, help a lot of MSMEs, which are the most badly affected because of this crisis. So today also, it first of all released certain additional financing facilities. I think around 10,000 crores was released for NABARD and National Housing Bank. Basically, this money will be forwarded to other smaller MSMEs and NBFCs for financing real estate projects and housing projects. So, till now, broadly, what the economy had done was that it had given a moratorium on existing EMIs. So, it had said that, listen, for the next 3 months or 4 months, you don't have to necessarily pay. We'll just add these 4 months later on in your tenure and we'll charge some extra interest. But what RBI has now come up with is a system where it said that it is allowing a lot of loans which would otherwise be categorized as bad loans or NPAs at the end of August 31st, because that's where the moratorium gets over. It is saying that the borrowers and lenders can sit together and decide if there is a way to restructure a particular loan. Instead of giving a moratorium, just restructure the loan. So for a particular company, what is the revenue flow, profitability levels, savings, and stuff? Every company can then sit down, figure out, is there a way I can pay this loan in a different format on different conditions? So that is a big thing, because once these loans get categorized as NPAs, other legalities come into the picture. So the crucial thing what RBI has done here is that it has said that you will not have to designate them as NPAs right now. You can restructure, and it's sort of a one-time restructuring facility that it has provided. So, which is a great thing, because a lot of businesses are suffering for no fault of theirs. And it is very crucial to note here that the RBI said that this facility of restructuring will be given only to those businesses which were doing fine before the COVID disruption hit the economy. It is not for all businesses and everybody who was struggling prior to COVID. So that is a very crucial thing. And another thing that they have done is to allow greater amount of loans to be given in lieu of gold. So a lot of people do take loans based on the gold they have. They mortgage the gold. Now, typically, you could only get something like 75 to 80% of it. I think now the loans can be given up to 90% of the gold value. So that allows you some more money for the borrowers. There is only one reason for caution here, is that gold prices right now are pretty high, because everybody is sort of investing in gold because everybody is uncertain. So gold prices are pretty high. So right now, a 10 grams or say a kilo of gold or a 10 grams of gold typically right now is enjoying a lot of price in the market, but it may not be the case, and you may take a loan based on that price, but this price may not remain this high going forward. It is possible that in 6 months' time, these prices may come down. And then all of a sudden, you may have taken a loan much higher than what the gold, the underlying asset value is. So there is reason for caution there. But yeah, broadly, what the RBI has done is that it has done a lot of different things to alleviate stress in the existing firms and provide better facilities for borrowers to take new loans.
So one thing the RBI says offers some hope for economic revival is the agricultural sector. And why is that, and how much can the agricultural sector really pull the economy out of the lurch?
Right. So, as we've seen, there are expectations that the monsoon would be a decent one and the crop productivity would be good. And broadly, the understanding is that the rural economy will benefit from that. But how far can this pull the larger economy out of the kind of mess that we are in? That has to be seen in context of what is the role of agriculture in overall GDP. So roughly 16 odd percent of overall gross value added in the economy comes from agriculture, and agriculture's contribution to the total gross value added, or broadly GDP, has been coming down over the years. So even though a lot of our workforce is involved in agriculture, and so if agriculture does well this year, it would have a salutary effect on the overall health of the rural economy and will provide a fillip to rural demand. However, uh, per se, rural demand or rural productivity or agricultural productivity is not such a big component of overall GDP that it can take the whole economy out of the current lurch. For that to happen, we would need the urban centers, the manufacturing plants, and the services sector to frankly get back on its feet. Without that happening, this would not be a sustained uplift.
Before we get to the next segment, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say that they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there's perhaps no other place that does this better than the Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of the newspaper, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log into indianexpress.com/explained and access their coverage 24/7. Explained by the Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. Exactly a year after the central government's decision to abrogate Article 370 of the Constitution and remove the special status granted to Jammu and Kashmir, there was a surprising development. The first Lieutenant Governor of the newly formed Union Territory, G.C. Murmu, announced that he had resigned. And less than 24 hours later, former Minister of State and BJP leader Manoj Sinha was appointed as his replacement. We're now speaking with Naveed Iqbal, who reports on Kashmir for the Indian Express, about how much of a surprise the announcement was, the problems Murmu had been facing, and the challenges his successor will face.
Okay, so Naveed, could you start by telling us who former Lieutenant Governor G.C. Murmu was and when was he appointed to the post?
Murmu was J&K's first LG after the special status of J&K was revoked and the UT was created. He's a 1985 batch IS officer and he'd served as expenditure secretary in the Ministry of Finance at the center. His was a surprise call, at least to people in Kashmir. Rajiv Mehrushi's name was doing the rounds with regard to who might be appointed as the first LG. His name was doing the rounds even yesterday when a fresh LG was to be appointed. Satyapal Malik's name was doing the round that he might be given an extension continuing from governor to LG of the UT, but that didn't happen. And then Murmu came in. He was sworn in on October 31st. And then since then, he spent about 7 months in office as LG of J&K.
So how much of a surprise was it when he resigned on Wednesday?
So there were some rumors to the effect that he was not getting along with the bureaucracy here. There was some tension between him and the CS. They were not getting along. There was talk of that. Also, we heard that Delhi was concerned about how he was not doing enough public outreach. But when we met him, our executive editor, Vaidyanath Nair, and I, on July 24th at the Raj Bhavan in Srinagar, he said that first when he came in, he went to Jammu. And then by the time he came back, the pandemic cases were surging in Kashmir, more than in Jammu. So he couldn't reach out then. But offices started operations on July 6th. And then around the second, third week, he started doing some public outreach, going first to North Kashmir and then to South Kashmir. So he sort of just started getting in the space where he would begin doing these public programs or reaching out to people, because he, from what he told us, wanted increased and enhanced public engagement in developmental works, which he thought that the bureaucracy was not reaching out enough. to do exactly that, to involve the public in their development works. I think by the time it broke, it came as a surprise. But I think Raj Bhavan had begun preparations during the day only. They cancelled his 3:30 meeting. They cancelled another 5 o'clock meeting that he had. And then he left for Jammu. So it may have been in the works through the day, but the news only came post 8 o'clock.
What is the importance of this public outreach in this whole scheme of things? As in, why is it so important for the government at this point?
See, because there are no elected representatives. The center has time and again, their argument is that we have grassroots democracy and we have panchs and sarpanchs who are in charge and they are elected representatives. But in the series that we just did, we've shown how the sarpanchs feel absolutely helpless and they feel like there is no accountability, there is no one that they can go to, and there's no one who listen to them with regard to work that they want to get done or grievances they have or funds that they need. So they can't take bigger decisions. Of course, they can take smaller decisions, but larger legislative matters or things that affect the UT as a whole, not just your everyday life. Those decisions, the panchs and sarpanchs, the PRIs are not in a position to take. So that has created a political vacuum that the bureaucracy cannot fill, which the last LG Murmu acknowledged. The team of bureaucrats led by the chief secretary, they tried a few things. They tried this back to the village program. They had 1 or 2 rounds of it, but then COVID hit and all efforts were directed there. There's a great vacuum in terms of who do the people go to and who can they take their grievances, their grudges and their requirements to. We weren't seeing much of that public engagement. People would normally go to the secretariat when ministers are in place, or when you have an elected representative in your area, you go knock his door. But you can't do the same with the civil servant. So that has been lacking in the UT.
And do we have any clue as to why he resigned?
There's widespread speculation about why this may have happened, but there's no clear answers as of now. But from what we know, one was definitely his tiff with the chief secretary of the state and the larger bureaucracy here, who he was trying to galvanize into, like I said, reaching out to the public more. And he said in an interview to us on 24 July that he wasn't in favor of using private land for public construction purposes. So he said he told the bureaucracy that wherever there is a state land, only there work will be conducted. And he issued a whip and he said, whoever does this will be punished. Among other things, he told us at least that he has no issues with the restoration of internet. We asked him that Pakistan will always be a threat. So, can you always keep internet down? He said he doesn't have an issue with that. And in fact, he'd been telling the center to restore internet as and when they could. And also, he'd been pitching for a revival of the political space in Kashmir because J&K cannot have an indefinite president's rule. At some point, you have to have an elected representative. At some point, you have to have people who are breathing down bureaucrats' necks to get work done and to involve the public. He'd also criticized the new media policy over which all journalists here had raised objections saying, how can the state decide, what is anti-national or what is fake news, etc.? How can you fact check us? Which he conceded, Murmu. And he said that they will have a look at this again because the state's information department does not have the capacity to understand, to make this distinction. If anyone at all, the agencies would make that distinction and not the DIPR. And he promised that he'd take a look at that again. So these are just a bunch of reasons which come to my mind that may have irked the center.
So, you mentioned the statement on 4G, you mentioned the statement he made on the political process. What was the fallout of all these statements that he's made?
One of the fallouts was that there's a PIL in the Supreme Court with regard to restoration of internet in J&K. And so the lawyer there had used the statement given to us that the LG is in favor of restoring internet, which the government's council then had said that they will verify. That was one. Elections and all are not in sight at all, but we'll have to see what the fallout of that is. And also leading off from that, the Election Commission had objected to his conjecture on when the elections might be held. I think he'd made statements saying they could be expected after the delimitation process is over. I think that didn't go down well either.
So Jammu and Kashmir now has a new lieutenant governor. What are the challenges he faces taking over from this now?
The first challenge of anyone at the helm of affairs in J&K right now is to deal with the COVID situation. That was Murmu's first challenge also as head of the newly carved UT. From what we know, Ladakh and Jammu, their numbers aren't that bad, but Kashmir's cases are surging and it's up and down every day. But the highest, I think, per day was around 709 one day. So those numbers are still increasing and fatalities are increasing every day. So that is the first challenge, of course. And then perhaps restoration of the political process and how anyone in charge can take that forward.
Since his arrest by Pakistani authorities in March 2016, retired Indian naval officer Kulbhushan Jadhav has spent over 3 years on death row after being convicted by a military court. Now, the Islamabad High Court, which is to hear an appeal against the sentence, has said India should be given another chance to appoint a lawyer to defend him. But what sounds like a simple instruction is full of complications when it involves India and Pakistan. We're now speaking with Shubhajit Roy, who reports on India's foreign affairs for the Indian Express, about why Jadhav still has no lawyer representing him in court and what is preventing him from getting one.
So, Shubhajit, the International Court of Justice has laid down conditions like the fact that Pakistan needed to provide Kulbhushan Jadhav with meeting Indian consulate officials. But then what has happened after that?
Well, the ICJ asked Pakistan to provide an effective review of the death sentence in July last year. After that, Pakistan did give consular access in September last year, which was under duress in the sense that there were Pakistani officials present at the meeting as well as the meeting was recorded. So Indian side really said that that's not how we want access. After that meeting, the Indian government had asked for an unhindered and unimpeded access, essentially meaning there will be no one else except for Jadhav and the meeting should not be recorded. After that, again, it provided access on 16th of July, in which again the same thing happened. And when the Indian diplomats went there to meet Jadhav with documents, essentially they wanted one power of attorney to be signed by Kulbhushan Jadhav, which will authorize the lawyer who's hired by the Indian High Commission to represent Jadhav at the court. Now, without that power of attorney, any lawyer cannot represent Jadhav for the case. But what happened was the Pakistani side did not allow the Indian diplomats, Indian consular officials to go inside the meeting with that power of attorney, with that piece of paper. And when they went inside, there were again security officials, Pakistani officials still there at the meeting, as well as there was a camera which was recording the meeting, which basically meant that the Indian side couldn't discuss the case freely with Jadhav, and Jadhav seemed to be under pressure and intimidated. This kind of an environment where Kulbhushan Jadhav was seen to be intimidated, and because Indian side could not get that signature from Jadhav on that power of attorney, therefore that particular meeting did not actually lead to any fruitful, productive results. And the Indian diplomats had to walk out after lodging their protests. So that's what happened, because that particular power of attorney was extremely crucial for the Indian government and the Indian High Commission to represent on Jadhav's behalf in the Islamabad High Court, which is now hearing the case of Jadhav as a way to review the sentence that has been given by the military court, which has sentenced him to death.
So, like you mentioned, the Islamabad High Court is now hearing the matter and how there's this sort of confusion over this power of attorney. So, does it mean that there is no lawyer representing Jadhav presently in the High Court? And also, how is this High Court hearing, say, different from the previous trial court hearing?
So there was no trial court in the sense that it was a military court which essentially sentenced Jadhav to death, and the proceedings of that particular court were completely non-transparent. Nobody knows who argued, what were the charges made, what are the arguments made at the court. So it was very opaque. So the Indian side has asked for the FIR, the copy of the charge sheet, the copy of the arguments, the petitions filed by the Pakistani government or the Pakistani military, as well as the arguments made by Jadhav in that particular military court. None of that has been made available so far to the Indian side. Now, Islamabad High Court is essentially reviewing that particular judgment because ICJ said that the death sentence must be effectively reviewed. The operative word was effectively review the death sentence. Now, for that, Islamabad High Court now has set up a two-judge bench, which is headed by the Chief Justice of the Islamabad High Court, where this process needs to be done where the Indian side will have to hire a lawyer which represents Jadhav's case, and Pakistan government obviously will represent its own case on behalf of the military or on behalf of the security establishment which sentenced Jadhav to death. Now, what has happened is when the Indian side hired a lawyer and it had to file the review petition in the Islamabad High Court, it needed two sets of documents. First was the power of attorney, without which he or she would not have any locus standi to approach the court on behalf of Jadhav. And the second set of documents would be what I said, these FIR, charge sheet, and the record of the proceedings in that military court. Now, both those documents were not given to the lawyer who was hired by the Indian High Commission to represent on behalf of Jadhav. As a result, he or she could not file that review petition. Now, this time, Islamabad High Court has asked the Pakistan government to give India another chance, an opportunity to hire a lawyer so that Jadhav's case can be represented.
So what is the complication now then? So the lawyer who was appointed earlier cannot represent Jadhav without this power of attorney, but now Pakistan itself has to hire a lawyer to represent Jadhav. Isn't that a little confusing in terms of who's even going to represent him now?
Yeah, so Pakistan has said that he must be given an opportunity to hire a lawyer. Now, Indian High Commission has already hired a lawyer. So what now needs to be done is he or she has to be given these two sets of documents. One, the power of attorney, and second, these sets of documents. So a lawyer armed with these documents would give a chance to effectively review the sentence. Now, to get that power of attorney, the Indian side will need to have what is called an unhindered, unimpeded consular access to Jadhav so that they can get this document signed by Jadhav, as well as get access to all these documents. Now, that is where the complication lies, that a lawyer who has to be a Pakistani national, and he has to have access to all these documents. Unless that happens, just hiring a lawyer would not make any meaningful step forward.
So in this confusing scenario now, what are Jadhav's and say India's recourses for appeal in this scenario?
So, well, right now, India, last I heard, they were expecting Pakistan to approach them formally, officially, to appoint a lawyer. Now, obviously, since a lawyer is already in place, what India's options are is that to get an effective review of the death sentence to Jadhav, they need access to both these sets of documents. So that would be the next step where India would ask for these sets of documents and consular access, which would be unhindered and unimpeded, where the Indian diplomats can freely and frankly discuss the case with Jadhav. And Jadhav should not be in the fear of any retribution and should not feel intimidated at all to discuss the case. So that, I think, would be the next step to be followed from the Indian side. And that for Jadhav would also be mean appealing against his death sentence.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show, as always, was edited and mixed by our producer Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explained page. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know and understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet to us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.